Hey everyone, Dr. Kaminsky here for the Learning Scientists. In this month's office hours video, I wanted to go over self-regulated learning and just kind of provide an overview of what that is, what the different components are, and maybe talk a little bit more specifically about when and how and why we might be interested in self-regulated learning. Um, so self-regulated learning is a concept that I see referred to a lot in just in education in general, a little bit more specifically in medical education. It's something that's come up quite a bit. And it generally refers to, it's a great name for a thing because it is what it sounds like. It's about how does a learner regulate themselves as they are going through the learning process, right? So to kind of answer my last question first, it's really useful in contexts where we have less formal education or educational structures, or we know that learning is going to be highly individual and variable, right? We might care a little bit more about people regulating their own learning because they're not getting as much, for a variety of reasons, they're not getting as much structured feedback or kind of like progression as they move through some knowledge. So this is really relevant again in educational contexts, but particularly I think sort of like postgraduate education and training and professional settings where you are having to learn about things as you go along, right? Where there's maybe no set curriculum about it, or you're in an area that's totally new, right? Maybe your field is a burgeoning field and there's just not that much work on stuff, or you didn't get a formal education in something. And so you're kind of learning as you're going along, right? So there are a variety of different contexts where we might want to know about self-regulated learning because we have less kind of regulation from the outside. We also know that generally students who are higher in self-regulated learning do tend to be better students because they're able to make assessments about where they're at, what they should do, right, and sort of operate a little bit more independently than the students who maybe don't have or aren't as strong in these skills. So that's generally self-regulated learning and who it applies to. What is it specifically? That's a little bit more complicated. There are several different models. I am pulling from an overview paper in Frontiers in Psychology. I'll put the citation in the description of the video so you can, I think this is an open source journal, so you should be able to go and find this paper if you want to read a little bit more specifically. But they provide a overview of various different models of self-regulated learning and sort of provide the fact that they are all different but similar. There are some overlapping constructs. In general, the things that we see in common across these different models of self-regulated learning and how one would actually like approach regulating their own learning, there are generally three distinct phases. The first phase being a planning or a forethought phase. So before you engage in a learning activity, and a learning activity can mean a variety of things, but we'll get to that when we talk about the engagement or process part of it. There's planning. There's what am I doing here, right? Like, what do I hope to get out of it? What are my goals? How am I going to approach this? Right. So no matter what the learning activity is, there should be some amount of forethought, something planning, something that's happening at the beginning, right? That's going to do a few different things for the learner. One is to just know what the heck's happening, to kind of orient them to have a plan. Hopefully that's an effective plan. Hopefully that's something that will actually improve their learning, to help them set goals so that we can achieve those goals. And then I would also say a lot of what this is doing is activating prior knowledge. And helping, which we know facilitates, that we know improves learning. So, for example, let's say the activity you're going to engage in is going to a talk or a lecture, a professional development session, or you're a student going to a class, right? Whatever it is, then you would want to know, okay, like, what am I doing here? Why would I go to this thing? Why is this relevant to me? What are my goals? Like, by the end of this thing, I should know what. When I work with students, I tell them that they should have questions. I know that I do this in my own professional development context. If I am attending a session or a talk on something, even if it's just a brief, we're talking like 1 to 2 minute exercise of saying, all right, based on this title, I think these are the things that they're going to talk about. I think for me, what's going to be important are these other things, right? So I'm generating some ideas, trying to do some planning in terms of like, what am I hoping to get out of this? To be perfectly honest, if it's a professional development thing, this is usually happening over lunch. And so I'm trying to decide like how much attention I need to be paying when, because I'm answering emails, or like, is this something where like, this is so highly relevant, I have to devote my full attention and I am like taking notes over it? Or is this something where I'm like, I'm just kind of, it'd be good to see people and network, and I'm here to be here and kind of listen passively, but I don't have so many active goals, right? And unfortunately, I think students are probably making the same type of estimation when they're going to, is this a class I'm just showing up just to show up? Or is this something where like, this is directly relevant, highly important to me, I need to make sure I'm engaged in this in the best way possible? And if so, what are the strategies, what are the planning things that I'm going to do for this, right? Like, do I need to bring a pen and paper? Those kinds of basic things. That's all forethought and planning. Then you actually engage in whatever the learning activity is. You actually get the performance, engagement, whatever this is, you actually have to go through this learning thing. So maybe this is reading a chapter or an article. Maybe it's, like I said, some sort of professional development lecture or training. Maybe you're listening to a podcast. Maybe you're sitting in class, right? There's all different ways in which we would seek to learn from some type of learning activity. And in this phase, again, all the different models kind of vary on the specifics of it, but in general, they talk about the importance of monitoring your learning as you're going through this. So are there things you're doing that you are kind of checking your understanding as you're going through a process? Are you engaging in specific and directed processes? In this context, I often work with students who are doing a lot of practice questions and practice tests in preparation for very big, important tests in medical school. And here I offer like some specific test taking strategies to help them, again, very actively monitor and assess their performance as they're going through, so they can have more rich information for this later stage, for the assessment stage that comes after this. And they can also have real-time information and feedback, because that's also important. Right? As we're going through a lecture, let's say, or a talk, monitoring and assessing your understanding of maybe those learning goals that you looked at before. I always think it's best practice in that planning forethought phase, at the very least, right? If you've got a PD session at lunch, write down 2 questions you have before going in. But just something to help you think, what am I doing here? What do I hope to get out of this? Like at the bare minimum. And as you're going through, when you're actually engaging, hopefully, right, listening carefully, as I'm sure you always do, are you answering these questions? Is this relevant? Are these questions even still relevant? Sometimes, you're wildly wrong. You're like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Do I need to like come up with some new questions? In monitoring your own learning and engagement of these things, so that you can ask a question during, right? To say, oh, hey, actually, I was wondering about this. Could you speak specifically about this thing, right? Like that is all online active monitoring, assessment, monitoring, and control that you have to do, right? As you're thinking about your thinking while you're engaged in the actual task itself. So that's the second kind of phase. The third phase is an appraisal phase, where or a reflection phase. After that's happened, after the podcast, after the talk, after maybe a practice session of something, it's time to reflect on it. Did that go the way you thought it would? Did you get the questions answered that you wanted to have answered? Did you meet the learning goals that you thought, right? You set down to, and I always encourage students, right, when you're studying, to set very specific learning goals. Don't just say, I'm going to study chapter 5, right? That's, how do you know if you've studied chapter 5? Instead, I would say like, okay, I'm going to be able to memorize the definition of these 5 terms. I can explain and describe the relationship between these 3 terms, right? So very specific things. You know when you've done it, you know if you haven't, right? So then in this appraisal phase, you're able to say like, okay, yeah, I can do these things I said I was going to do in the context of something that's more like lifelong learning, more like professional development, more like career training. Did that session, did that training answer my questions? Did I take out from it what I thought I needed to take out from it? If so, great, right? Then I know I should maybe keep doing these things in the future, or I could be like, all right, I'm satisfied here. I feel much more confident in my ability to do X, Y, and Z. If not, why? Was it because the session wasn't what you thought it would be? It wasn't tailored to your needs appropriately? Or was it like, I just, I should have been engaged better. I should have put away my laptop, or, whatever it is, right? What can I do differently next time I'm in this scenario so that I can get the most out of my learning here? And in the context of more like student classroom settings, that could be, okay, I read through and I made notes, but I'm kind of assessing my notes. And I don't think my notes really, like, I just kind of like wrote random thoughts and phrases that came to mind. And I'm having trouble assessing my learning. Like, I wrote a paragraph here. I don't know if that means that I met my goal, right? Maybe my goal wasn't specific. Maybe that's part of what I need to tweak, right? So what's kind of important, I think all the models definitely agree on here, is that like these appraisals, these reflections are most useful when they are adaptive, when they're healthy, right? Because we can also have very negative, unhelpful appraisals like, well, I failed that test because I'm dumb and because I know nothing and clearly I should stop trying, right? Like that's not the kind of appraisals we're hoping that students, that learners, that people engaged actively in this process are making. So that could be another point where you as a learner or students as learners need to say like, okay, I don't feel great about that, but what have I learned from this, right? What can I change moving forward? Do I need to seek out more information so that I can make better choices? Or I can like get different resources that are more appropriate for me, right? All kinds of different things that we might do in that appraisal phase. So again, self-regulated learning, generally, how do learners regulate their own learning? A lot of it's a lot of monitoring and assessment, but also a lot of like what we might consider like social, emotional, like regulation and skills, right? There's a lot of different sub skills that go into these three general phases of forethought planning, engagements, sort of like procedural stuff, and then reflection and appraisal. So those are in general what we're doing, and it's complicated. I think about this a lot as a member of the learning scientists because we spend a lot of time and effort trying to explain effective learning strategies, and in the context of self-regulated learning, I wonder a lot about how well people are able to deploy these strategies when and where they are most useful for that learner, for that material, right? Learning's complicated. There are so many different factors that affect learning. And so it's right interesting to me how all these things interact and interplay with one another so that people are able to make appropriate choices to like maximize their learning as they're going through this process. So I hope this was a useful overview of what this term is if you've heard it and weren't sure. It also was somewhat confusing, at least for me, as I, was first started learning about self-regulated learning because there are many different models. And so I was like, which one's the model? There's not really the model. There are several that are out there and, like I said, emphasize different things and maybe more appropriate in one context versus the other. In general, the ones that I see and the ones that this paper says are cited most often are Zimmerman and Pintrick are the sort of the two names we see most associated with self-regulated learning. But there are other models out there, again, with slightly different emphasis on the different components of these different phases, how these interact, maybe the time course of them. It's a big complicated thing. Learning's complicated, which is why I think it's so interesting and fascinating. Again, I'll try to put that in the description so that you can read through that paper more in depth if you'd like, or if you'd just like to see these big like overview things. But hopefully that was a useful overview of self-regulated learning.